Okay, welcome. Um, this is our first chapter in Hurley's Human Body and Health and Illness. And what we're doing here in chapter one is just taking a survey of the layout of the human body and introducing you to some important concepts that you'll use throughout the course. So, one of the things that we have to appreciate um, as we begin our journey through the human body is that we call this course Anatomy and Physiology because anatomy deals primarily with the structure of the human body and physiology deals with the function. We'll move from there to talking about the different levels of organization of the human body. We'll talk about the major organ systems. We'll define homeostasis, and we'll talk about anatomical position. We'll list some common terms for relative positions of the body, describe the three major planes of the body, talk about anatomical terms for quadrants and regions, and talk about the major body cavities. So, the reason that we're calling this course Anatomy and Physiology is anatomy deals with the structure of the body, basically where the parts of the body are, what they look like, and um, physiology deals more with how they function. Okay, so you need both in order to get a full understanding of the human body. If we were to draw a parallel, okay, your car mechanic has to know the anatomy and the physiology of an automobile. If he just knew the anatomy of the automobile, he might be able to tell you where the windshield was and where the wheels are and where the engine block is. But if he didn't know the function of any of those parts, then his usefulness would be limited, right? So the physiology would be what each of those parts actually does, right? The engine block is where the pistons are housed, and that's where the gasoline from the gas tank is lit by the spark plug, and an explosion moves the pistons, right? And that turns the crankshaft, and that eventually turns the wheels of your car. Um, the hood of your car is covering the top of the engine and the other associated parts so that they don't get dust and debris in them. And the windshield, of course, is the glass that sits between the driver and the passenger front seat and the outside world. And it keeps oncoming material from um, getting inside the cabin and interfering with the ability of the driver to see where he's going. Okay? So you can apply those same kind of ideas to the body, right? If we were talking about, say, the cardiovascular system, okay, the anatomy would be the heart and its location in the middle of the chest, the blood vessels, which are tubes that run either away from the heart in the case of arteries or towards the heart in the case of veins, and then the blood that they carry. Okay, well, that's all well and good. What are the parts for? Okay, and again, um, we can start with the heart. The heart is the blood pump. Okay, if we don't pump the blood throughout the body, then it's not going to be useful as a way to deliver nutrients to the cells of the body so they can live and help us to remove waste products that can't build up or else they'd kill cells and tissues. Okay, the blood that's carried in the blood vessels carries oxygen and nutrients and waste products and a lot of fluid and immune components that defend against disease and chemicals called hormones that help the body talk to itself. Okay? And of course, the blood vessels are just the avenues that the blood takes around the body to get to all the cells and all the tissues. An important point with all this is that structure and function are closely related. A engineer would say that form follows function, which basically is a way of saying that the reason that something has a series of features is because it has a particular job to do. Okay, so there are no features that you'll see in an organ or a tissue or a cell that are decorative. Okay, they all have an important role. Um, we can draw the analogy with a screwdriver, right? A screwdriver has a handle and a shaft and a head. Okay, that's the anatomy of the screwdriver. Um, what are those parts for? Well, the handle is so you can grip the tool. The shaft is so that you can transfer the force of the grip and the twist to the head, which is able to then engage a screw and screw it into drywall or wood. Okay, so that would be one example. One of the things that we address in anatomy and physiology is an understanding of the levels of organization from the simple to the most complex, so that um, we can really um, understand by learning about the smallest building blocks how the largest structures actually work. Okay, so the smallest building block of everything is the atom. Okay, atoms can connect to each other through interactions called chemical bonds to form molecules. Molecules can be arranged in a certain order to form the smallest unit of living matter, which is the cell. Cells with similar structures and functions act together to form tissues, which are groups of cells doing a job that a single cell can't. Different tissues can come together to produce functioning organs, and then organs can come together to form organ systems, and all the organ systems together make up the human organism. If we look at the different organ systems, we'll go through them one by one. They include the integumentary system, which is made up of your skin, your hair, your nails, and their associated glands. The skeletal system, which is made up of your bones and cartilage. The muscular system, which is made up of the three kinds of muscle tissue: skeletal, which is attached to your bones; smooth, which is in your organs; and cardiac muscle, which is only found in the heart. The nervous system, okay, the endocrine system, the circulatory system, the lymphatic, immune, and respiratory systems, the digestive, the urinary, and the reproductive systems. All of these systems are dependent on each other. If one were to shut down, the other systems would suffer. So let's begin with the integumentary system. Over here on the left, this is the first system that you see when you see somebody, right? This is their skin, their hair, their nails, and your sweat glands and your sebaceous glands, your oil glands. The job of the integumentary system is to provide a barrier between the inside of the body and the outside world in order to protect it from infection and disease. It's also an important sensory organ. A lot of sensations such as pain, touch, tickle, and pressure can be picked up by the skin and relayed back to the brain, where we have an idea of what's happening on the surface of our body. Okay? It's a way to regulate our body temperature. It allows us to cool the body when we get too hot by the production of sweat and by bringing blood to the surface. Okay? And it allows us to keep the body's heat in when we're cold outside by moving that blood to our core and away from the surface, and reducing sweat production and causing us to get goosebumps. Okay, the hair and the nails are, they don't serve much purpose now, but a long time ago, when we were covered from head to foot in a lot of hair and fur, it acted to hold in our body heat, okay, and also provided some padding and protection. And our nails used to be our claws, so they used to be defense weapons. Um, Now they don't really serve those purposes as effectively, and that's because over time we figured out how to make clothing and how to produce our own weapons, and so we didn't need those structures anymore, and they evolved away. Okay? The skin's also a major source of vitamin D, okay, which is important for mineralizing bone, which brings us to the middle system here, the skeletal system. Right? The skeletal system provides the body a framework. It's also a site of blood production. It's a site where we store lots of minerals. It allows us to move at structures that are called joints. And it also protects a lot of our internal organs, right? Our vital organs are enclosed in bone in many cases. Our brain and brainstem are inside our cranium. Our spinal cord is inside our vertebral column, and our heart and our lungs are inside our bony thorax, our rib cage. Okay, and then some of our pelvic organs, like our bladder and reproductive organs, are contained inside the pelvic girdle, okay, which is formed by a couple of bones called the os coxa. Okay? Without the skeletal system, we would have a difficult time moving. Okay, the body wouldn't have an efficient frame, and it would be more difficult for us to interact with our environment. Another component of the skeletal system besides our bones is the cartilage that's found in between bones, which is present at joints. So it's a type of padding and protection and reinforcement so that bones that participate in joints don't bang against each other and chip and cause irritation in the joints. Okay, and it also serves in many cases to seal certain bones to each other. Okay? All right. The muscular system, which is this last system on the right, is made up of three different kinds of muscle tissue. The kind that you can see in this drawing is called skeletal muscle tissue, and we control it consciously in order to perform movement. So our brain tells it what to do with our awareness. Cardiac muscle tissue is only found in the heart, and it operates all by itself, even though it is under control of a division of the nervous system that we don't consciously run, called the autonomic nervous system, and we'll learn about that later. And then smooth muscle, which is inside the walls of our organs, provides the ability for those organs to move materials through them if they are hollow organs. So smooth muscle is important for things like regulating the movement of food through the digestive system and regulating where air flows in the respiratory system and regulating things like our blood pressure. Okay, so those are just a few of the roles for smooth muscle, which we also don't consciously control. It's controlled primarily, again, by the autonomic nervous system. The nervous system is one of the body's two communication networks along with the endocrine system. And what the nervous system does is it allows the body to communicate with itself. So it's made up of the brain, the brainstem, and the spinal cord. Those are the components of what we call the central nervous system. And then outside that we have the peripheral nerves. So the nervous system is able to take physical changes either on the body or in the body and turn those into pieces of electrical information that get relayed by nerves to the central nervous system, where they move up to either the brainstem or the brain, and those pieces of information are then sort of combined with each other, and then we form an idea of what we want to do, and then we send those commands out from the brain or the brainstem to the spinal cord to the peripheral nerves, and then they talk to their targets, whether they be muscles or organs, and they respond in a way that's more likely to keep us alive. Okay. The endocrine system is a lot like the nervous system, but instead of using structures like nerves and chemicals like neurotransmitters, which are the chemicals that nerves use to talk to their target organs, it uses chemicals called hormones that certain organs secrete into the blood, and then the heart beats, and that moves those chemicals around the body. And when those chemicals arrive at tissues that can attach to them, that produces a change in those targets that produces conditions that eventually feed back to the original organ and turn off the production of that particular hormone. Okay? So the components of the endocrine system include the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland and the pineal gland, the thyroid gland, the thymus, the adrenal glands, the pancreas, and the gonads. Okay? And the reason that we have both an endocrine and a nervous system is because the endocrine system is able to allow the body to communicate with itself without using lots and lots of energy. Okay? So sometimes it's important that we get something done pretty quickly, and that's when the nervous system goes to work. And sometimes we don't have to get a task done nearly as fast, and that's primarily where the endocrine system works. The cardiovascular system here in the middle is made up of the heart and the blood vessels and the blood that they carry. And the job of the cardiovascular system is to pump blood around the body. And the reason we need to do that is because the blood contains oxygen, which it gets from the respiratory system. And the oxygen is delivered by the blood to the cells and the tissues, and that allows the cells and tissues to make a lot of chemical energy. Okay? If we didn't have that oxygen, we wouldn't be able to make as much energy, and we would likely die. In addition, the blood also carries away waste products that build up in the body so that they can be cleared and eliminated by a few systems we're going to talk about in a minute: the urinary system and the respiratory system. Okay? And as long as we keep getting rid of those waste products, our cells and tissues can continue to function. It's also a way to deliver hormones to their targets and deliver immune cells to areas of the body that need defense against disease. Okay? And it's also a major way to regulate the body's temperature and its fluid content. Okay. Next set of systems. On the left is the lymphatic system. Okay, it's made up of the lymph nodes, the lymphatic vessels, the spleen, the tonsils, and the thymus. Right. Basically, its job is to take fluid that is lost from the circulatory system in tiny blood vessels called capillaries, and then to filter that fluid at structures called lymph nodes in order to check for the presence of things that cause disease called pathogens. It then destroys those pathogens, and then it warns our immune system that those pathogens are in the body, and then our immune system can generate cells that will go out and destroy those pathogens wherever they might be found. That filtered fluid then returns to the blood supply, and this process is continuous. Okay? In addition, the lymphatic system also transports our dietary fat from our digestive system to our liver, where the liver can either store it or it can release it into the blood so that the other tissues of the body can use it for things like energy and building stuff. Okay? The spleen is kind of a special part of the lymphatic system because instead of cleaning up the fluid between cells, it specifically cleans up our blood. So it removes pathogens from the blood, and it also helps to trap and recycle red blood cells when they wear out. The middle system is the digestive system, and its job is to mechanically and chemically break down the food that we eat so that we can load those nutrients into our blood supply, and then from there the nutrient-rich blood goes to an organ called the liver, and the liver can then store those molecules for later use as either fat or as a type of starchy molecule called glycogen. And then when we need those nutrients in the blood, the liver can turn around and take the fat and the glycogen and break it down and put it back into the blood, and then the circulatory system can pump those nutrients to all the cells and tissues of the body so that they can remove the energy from those molecules and then use that energy to basically perform the work of life. Okay? It also allows us to eliminate the waste products in our diet. The stuff that we can't digest passes all the way through the digestive system and out the rectum and the anus. The respiratory system, and the components, are the oral cavity, the pharynx, the esophagus, the stomach, the large and small intestine, the rectum, and the anus. Okay? The gallbladder, the liver, and tucked behind here, the pancreas, and of course in the oral cavity, the teeth, the tongue, and the salivary glands. And then in the respiratory system, we have the nasal cavity, the pharynx, the larynx, the trachea, the bronchi, the bronchioles, and the lungs, and a muscle called the diaphragm. Okay? And the job of the respiratory system is to pull in air, okay? And when we pull in air, The air has some oxygen in it. About 20% of the air we breathe is oxygen. And it takes that oxygen and allows it to diffuse into our blood supply, while a toxic gas called carbon dioxide diffuses out of our blood and into the air that we breathe out. So that helps to eliminate a waste product that, if it built up, would kill us. Okay? And that oxygen is then carried by the circulatory system to the tissues of the body so that it can make as much energy as possible. Okay? In the presence of oxygen, our cells and tissues make 20 times more energy than they do without it. And so that's why we have to breathe in order to live. Okay? The urinary system on the left is made up of the kidneys, the ureters, the urinary bladder, and the urethra. Okay? And its job is to filter waste products out of the blood. Most of those waste products contain nitrogen. If nitrogen compounds are allowed to build up in the blood or in the tissue fluid, that would cause a chemical change. It would shift something called our pH to the point where we would eventually go into a coma and die. Okay? If both your kidneys were to fail, for instance, and we didn't do anything about it, you would have about 2 days to live. Okay? Whereas if you lose one kidney, you can get by on the other one for your lifetime. That's why sometimes people donate kidneys to relatives. The other role of the kidneys is to regulate our blood pressure and our fluid balance and our body's pH. The reproductive system is closely associated with the urinary system. In the female, it's made up of the vagina, the cervix, the uterus, the fallopian tubes, and the ovaries. Okay? And in the female, the job of the reproductive system is to manufacture and release eggs, and also to house the fertilized egg in the uterus as it develops from a fertilized egg called a zygote to an embryo to a fetus and all the way to a neonate, which is almost a baby, right? And then, of course, birth occurs when the baby emerges from the uterus through the cervix and the vagina and is delivered into the outside world. Okay, so the female has a much bigger job with her reproductive system than in the male reproductive system, which is made up of just the testes, the epididymis, the vas deferens, the prostate gland, the bulbourethral gland, and the seminal vesicle, as well as the urethra. Okay, and in guys, the reproductive system's job is to deliver the male gamete, which are the sperm cells, into the female reproductive system so that fertilization can happen and we can have childbirth. Okay? So that's just a quick thumbnail sketch of what the body systems are about. And we wanted to point out that if one body system were to fail, the other body systems would likely also fail. An example would be we could take the digestive system, right? If you couldn't move food through the digestive system, like let's say your mouth was sewn shut. We'll take an extreme example. You wouldn't be able to take in food, which means you wouldn't be able to mechanically and chemically break down anything in your diet. You wouldn't be able to load those nutrients into the blood. They wouldn't make it to the liver, and the liver wouldn't be able to deliver any nutrients to any of the cells and tissues in the body, and then all the organ systems would shut down and you would die. Okay? So the organ systems depend on each other in order to function. Now our next topic is something called homeostasis, and what I want you to do is watch this little video on homeostasis, and I'll rejoin you on the back end.
Fluctuations in the internal and external environments are constant for living organisms. The body responds to these fluctuations by a process called homeostasis, the process of maintaining a relatively stable internal environment. We will look at fluctuations in blood glucose levels as an example of homeostasis. You are studying for a biology exam, about to review the chapter on cellular respiration, and decide you need a little extra energy. You consume an entire 32-ounce bottle of soda, approximately 1 liter. Your mid-study snack contained 100 grams of sugar and 400 calories. At first, you might have a burst of energy, but 30 minutes later, you begin to feel lightheaded and can't seem to keep your eyes open or your mind from wandering. What happened? To understand this unexpected result, we'll explore how your metabolism can get out of balance and how your body works to bring it back to normal. The cells of your body are fueled by glucose molecules that travel throughout your body in the bloodstream. Because glucose is so important, your body responds to fluctuations in blood glucose levels to maintain stable levels through homeostasis. After consuming food, the mouth and stomach begin the process of mechanical and chemical digestion. The partially digested food moves from the stomach to the small intestine, where larger molecules are further broken down. Smaller molecules, like the monosaccharides, glucose and fructose, are absorbed by the cells lining the intestine. Glucose passes out of the cells and into the interstitial fluid, then into the bloodstream. Once individual glucose molecules move into your bloodstream, your blood glucose level rises rapidly. The high sugar content of the soda causes a spike in blood glucose, triggering a hyperglycemic condition. The pancreas detects an increase in glucose levels in the bloodstream. In response, the beta cells of the pancreatic islets produce and secrete the hormone insulin into the bloodstream. Insulin binds to cell surface receptors and stimulates the transport of glucose into the cells of the body. Because of this rapid increase of insulin in response to the large amount of glucose from the soda, too much glucose is removed from the blood and stored as glycogen inside liver and muscle cells. As a result, your blood is now glucose deficient, a hypoglycemic condition. This low blood glucose level can cause lightheadedness, fatigue, and hunger. In response to glucose-deficient blood, the alpha cells of the pancreatic islets will produce and secrete the hormone glucagon. Once glucagon levels rise in the bloodstream, glucagon will diffuse out of the blood and bind to cell surface receptors in the liver, triggering the conversion of glycogen to glucose in liver cells. The stored glucose is released back into the bloodstream until homeostasis has been achieved. Turn back the clock. What would happen if you ate an apple, a handful of pistachios, or some popcorn instead of a liter of soda? The consumption of complex carbohydrates instead of simple sugars, like the ones found in the soda, results in a lower spike in blood glucose. Complex carbohydrates, like those found in healthier snacks, take longer to digest, so glucose is slower to enter the bloodstream. Homeostasis of blood glucose levels is more easily maintained because the drastic changes to glucose concentrations are diminished, without feelings of hunger or fatigue. The hunger experienced during bouts of low blood sugar, in addition to disrupting short-term homeostasis, can be a contributing factor to overeating and long-term problems like obesity. Glucose is also taken up by adipose cells during the spike in blood glucose and can be converted into fat. This, along with exaggerated portion size, sedentary lifestyles, and poor nutritional choices, are contributors to the worldwide obesity epidemic. By consuming more calories from natural sources containing complex carbohydrates, your body can maintain homeostasis of blood glucose levels more effectively. This can reduce your risk of gaining weight and improve your overall health. It can even help you keep focused while studying for that important biology exam.
So, essentially, homeostasis is the ability of the body to maintain certain variables within a reasonable limit that's compatible with life. Okay, um, if we didn't do that, we would die. Okay, so it's able to do things like maintain a temperature within a range that keeps us alive, a body pH within a range that keeps us alive, a body fluid balance in a range that keeps us alive. All right. If we get outside that range, then we have a condition called disease, which literally means not at ease. And then if we get too far outside that range, we die. Okay. So the idea with homeostasis is that there are structures in the body that monitor these conditions, and the first structure that we run into is the receptor, which is able to detect changes that need to be acted on. All right. It then relays that information to a control center. Okay. Often this control center is the brain or the brain stem. Okay. In some cases, it could be an endocrine organ. And then the control center takes that information and decides what the appropriate command is, and then it issues that command to the effectors. Okay. If we're using the nervous system as a control center, we would be likely looking at the brainstem or the brain, and then the effectors would be the targets of nerve impulses designed to counteract that stimulus. Okay? All right. Our next topic is anatomical position and the language of anatomy. So you want to take a listen here.
The language of anatomy.
If you're gonna be successful in the study of anatomy, you gotta be tough. And there are certain terms that are used over and over again that we have to beat into your head so you can succeed.
I'm Slim Goodbody.
I'm Slim Goodbody.
Good body.
Slim Goodbody.
I'm Slim Goodbody.
Hi, I'm Slim Goodbody, and I'm going to walk you through some of the terms you need to learn in order to understand anatomy. Anatomists have invented a special language that's really going to help us out as we chart our course through human anatomy. This language gives everyone who's familiar with it a universal understanding and a clarity when discussing the body, so we'll need to be really familiar with it.
For example, the word anatomy comes from the Greek words toumi, meaning to cut, and ana, meaning up, to cut up.
A lot of people use the term gross anatomy when studying the body. This is a specific type of anatomy. The term gross anatomy, contrary to popular belief, is not the study of boogies, puncture wounds, or the dad from Family Ties, but rather the study of bodily structures visible to the naked eye.
But since we're studying general anatomy, we're dealing with structures both visible and invisible to the naked eye. Because of this, it's important that you learn the terms that describe bodily orientation and direction. You want to be able to describe where certain parts of the body are located, and you also want to be able to understand us when we're describing where a structure is found relative to another one. So a firm grasp on these anatomical terms will help you get a handle on how to locate and identify different bodily structures. So the first term you want to memorize is anatomical position. This is the standard position we refer to when we describe the location of body parts. We do this by separating the body into distinct parts using imaginary planes. These planes are known as the transverse plane, the frontal plane, and the sagittal plane.
The transverse, or horizontal plane, runs from right to left and divides the body into superior and inferior sections. Superior means above or upper, and inferior means below or lower. So the head is superior to the neck.
The frontal plane lies vertically along the body from head to foot. This is the long axis of the body. The frontal plane cuts the body up into anterior and posterior parts. Anterior means front, and posterior means back. So your rear end is posterior to your belly button.
And finally, the sagittal plane lies vertically, and it divides the body into right and left sections. When dealing with this section, the terms medial and lateral come in handy. Medial means toward midline, or the inner side of, and lateral means away from the midline, or on the outer side of. So, the groin is medial to the thigh because it's on the inner side of the thigh, and the eye is lateral to the bridge of the nose because it's on the outer side of the bridge.
Two other useful terms are proximal, meaning nearer the trunk, and distal, meaning further from the trunk. The trunk in this case refers to the axis of the body from where most limbs spring. So the elbow is proximal to the wrist because the elbow is closer to the trunk, and the foot is distal to the leg because the foot is further from the trunk than the leg.
So there you have it. We've cut the body into different parts and given you the terms to help you navigate it. Memorize these and you'll be on your way.
So as you can see, anatomical position is critical for a frame of reference when we refer to where structures are located in the body. And that position is shown here, standing erect, facing forward, arms at your side, toes and palms are forward. And all of the different relative positions in the body, as we saw in the video, are based on references from this position, okay? As an example, okay, there are directional terms that come in pairs that we need to learn, right? Superior, meaning closer to the head, and inferior, closer to the feet. So we would say, for instance, that your knees are superior to your ankles, all right? And your chin is inferior to your nose. Anterior and posterior, which can also be termed dorsal for posterior and ventral for anterior. Your nose is anterior to your ears, and your buttocks are posterior to your navel, okay? Medial and lateral. Medial means towards a midline that divides the body into two halves, and lateral means away from that midline. So your nose is medial to your eyes, and your ears are lateral to your nose, and your thumb is lateral to your little finger. Proximal and distal, which are two that throw people, basically this is along a limb, either closer to, which is in the proximal direction, or further from, which is in the distal direction, the trunk, right? The trunk being that region of the body that goes from your neck essentially to where your legs attach to the main portion of your body, all right? So we would say, for instance, that your wrist is distal to your elbow, and your fingertips are distal to your wrist, and your elbow is proximal to your wrist. We would say that your knees are proximal to your ankles, and the tips of your toes are distal to your ankles. Superficial and deep. Superficial meaning closer to the surface, and deep meaning further towards the core, okay? So superficial, an example, your skin is superficial to your skeletal system, and deep, your heart is deep to your rib cage, okay, or to your bony thorax, if you like. And then central and peripheral, right? Central meaning towards the middle of the body, and peripheral meaning towards the edges, right? So the heart would be central to the shoulders, okay, and the knees would be peripheral to the stomach, right? So that would be an example of the use of those terms in telling people relative locations. We talked in the video about different planes that you can use through the body, right? A sagittal plane divides the body into a right and left portion. A frontal or coronal plane divides the body into a front and back, and a transverse plane divides the body into a top and bottom. Now, why do we care so much about these planes of the body? Are we going to go around cutting the body into different sections? And the answer is not physically, no, but we can use techniques like X-ray and MRI and CT scan to see inside the body along these different planes, and that allows us to, number one, locate vital organs, but also find out where the effects of disease or trauma are located, and then we can know before we ever go into surgery where your problem is and exactly what we want to do about it. Before we had that technology, we used to have to do something called exploratory surgery, where we would open you up and look around for a problem, and we might or might not find it. And if we didn't find it, we would sew you back up, and we'd have to wait until the problem showed up again. Okay? These regional terms you're going to have to learn. They refer to areas of the body, and they're going to come up over and over again as we move through the skeletal system, the muscular system, the nervous and the circulatory system, and the lymphatic system, just to name a few. Again, notice that some of the terms on the back are not repeated on the front, but I can take an example of a particular term, and I can indicate to you why learning this map is important. So if we look, for instance, at the femoral region, okay, the femoral region, we can see here. Let's go with red. It's fine. Okay, this is the femoral region, right? So it's basically your thigh, the front and back of your thigh. Well, if we know that as part of our body map, it's not a surprise that the major bone in the upper leg is called the femur, and that there's a major artery that runs through the thigh called the femoral artery, a major vein called the femoral vein, and a major nerve called the femoral nerve. A set of muscles on the front of the thigh that help us kick called the quadriceps femoris, right? That means a four-headed muscle group that is on the front of the thigh. And then there's a two-headed muscle on the back of the thigh called the biceps femoris, all right? So as we learn these different terms, and they come up in structures that are found in other body systems, you can use this map to get an idea of approximately where these things are located. Okay, good. Cavities of the body are shown here. We can divide cavities of the body into the dorsal cavity, which is made up of the cranial cavity that contains the brain and the brainstem, and the spinal cavity, sometimes called the vertebral cavity, which contains the spinal cord. The ventral cavity is made up of thoracic cavity, which is your chest cavity, which contains the pleural cavities that house the lungs, and the mediastinum, which houses the pericardial cavity, which houses the heart. And then the abdominal pelvic cavity, which is below a structure called the diaphragm. This muscle right here aids us in breathing. It contracts when we inhale, and it relaxes when we exhale. You can see the cavities here. All of the cavities shown in the dorsal and ventral cavity are closed to the outside world, and as a result, they have membranes that are designed primarily for lubrication and protection. Okay, the thoracic, pleural, pericardial, and abdominal pelvic cavities are all coated with a type of tissue called a serous membrane that wraps both around the organs and around the chamber that the organ sits in, and it produces a lubricating fluid so that as the organs move, they don't rub against each other and damage each other due to friction. Okay? A dorsal cavity, where the central nervous system is located, contains cerebrospinal fluid, which allows the brain, the brainstem, and the spinal cord to float in an environment that is free of pathogens, and it's also tethered to those cavities by special structures that we'll talk about when we get to the nervous system. Other cavities that are closed to the outside world include many of our joint cavities, right? They're filled with something called synovial fluid. And then there are cavities that are open to the outside world, such as our digestive tract and our respiratory tract and our urinary tract. And those are coated with a different type of tissue called a mucous membrane, which produces a sticky fluid called mucus, which coats those cavities and traps pathogens and clears them, and also keeps particulates from getting into our deeper tissues. Here's a look at the cavities of the body. We can also divide the abdominal pelvic cavity into either 4 quadrants or 9 regions. Okay, the 4 quadrants are the right and left upper quadrant and the right and left lower quadrant. Now, remember here that when we're talking about right and left, we're always referring to the patient's right and left. And we can also divide it into a tic-tac-toe grid, which contains the right and left hypochondriac regions, the right and left lumbar regions, the right and left iliac regions, and then down the middle, the epigastric, the umbilical, and the hypogastric region. Now, why do we do this? We do this because our knowledge of anatomy allows us to know what organs are found in either these quadrants or these regions. And so if a patient comes in and complains about a pain or about trauma or an infection in a particular quadrant or region, we can make a guess as to what internal organs might be involved. Okay. Now, one of the things that we should note are what organs are in these different quadrants and regions, right? In the right upper quadrant, we have a lot of the liver and the gallbladder and some of the ascending and transverse colon and some parts of the small intestine, a little bit of the stomach, okay? In the left upper quadrant, we have the remainder of the liver, we have the bulk of the stomach, and we have the spleen and a large portion of the pancreas, which is behind here. We have portions of the transverse and descending colon, okay, and portions of the small intestine. In the right lower quadrant, we have the appendix, the cecum, the ascending colon, portions of the bladder, and small intestine, okay? And we also have in the right lower quadrant the ureters. In the left lower quadrant, we have bladder, we have small intestine, descending and sigmoid colon, and portions of the rectum and anus, which are in both the right and the left lower quadrants. We should also point out that the kidneys are going to be in the right upper and left upper quadrant, very close to the posterior of the body. Okay, so they're right about where the rib cage ends. Okay? In the regions, okay, the right hypochondriac houses mostly liver and a little bit of gallbladder. The epigastric is above the stomach, that's where the name comes from, and houses a lot of the stomach and some of the liver and a lot of the pancreas. And the left hypochondriac contains the spleen and some of the stomach and liver and a little bit of the pancreas. The right lumbar contains ascending colon and gallbladder and some small intestine. Umbilical region, transverse colon, small intestine. The left lumbar, transverse and descending colon and small intestine. The right iliac, the appendix, the cecum, and some ascending colon and some small intestine. The hypogastric, named because it's under the stomach, contains small intestine and bladder, okay, and some portions of the rectum and the anus. And the left iliac contains descending and sigmoid colon and some small intestine. Now, these names are important too, right? One of the things you'll notice as you read this book is that a lot of the terms in the book don't come from English, and the reason for that were that the first people to look at the human body were the Greeks and the Romans, and so they got the naming rights to the body. So a good idea as you work your way through this course is to look at websites on medical terminology, or maybe check a book of medical terminology out of the library and look at the prefixes, the word roots, and the suffixes to sort of help you out as you read the text. We can go through a few of these and maybe it'll help. If we look, for instance, at the right hypochondriac region, right? Hypo means below. Chondriac refers to cartilage, okay? A chondrocyte is a cartilage cell. Here, hypochondriac means below the cartilages that attach the ribs to the breastbone, which is the sternum, okay? Epigastric, epi means above, and gastric means stomach, okay? So this is the area above the stomach. And over here, the left hypochondriac region. Right lumbar region is named because it's near the lumbar spine in the lower back. The umbilical region is named because that's the attachment point for the umbilical cord. This is where your navel is located. And then there's the left lumbar. The right iliac or inguinal region is where the groin is located. The large fan-shaped portion of the pelvic bone is called the ilium. Okay, that's where it gets its name. The hypogastric region is below the stomach, and then we have the left iliac region. Okay, so we can take an example of how we would put this to work, right? If a patient came in and complained of severe pain in the right iliac region when you pressed on it, and you had a knowledge of anatomy, you would know that that could indicate inflammation in one of the organs located in that region, such as the appendix. Okay, so that could be an early indication of appendicitis. Right? Okay. If you have any questions, by all means email me, and I will respond within a day. And hope this has been informative, and I will see everybody in the next podcast.